Hi, I'm Dennis Ward, one of the hosts of APTN National News. We've expanded our Truth and Politics panel into a weekly podcast. Each episode, panelists Jennifer Leywitz and Negon Sinclair join us to examine key issues affecting Indigenous peoples across Canada. Listen and subscribe on your favorite podcast player.
I'm Sierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News in Focus. In this week's episode, we're putting organized crime in focus. First Nations communities from coast to coast are grappling with the impacts of drug trafficking. We take a closer look at how they're mobilizing against dealers who are preying on vulnerable community members. We'll also explore the long-standing challenge First Nations face in enforcing and prosecuting their bylaws. We begin by talking to Kenneth Jackson, a reporter for APTN Investigates. Back in October, Kenneth published an investigation called The Great Change to bring attention to big city drug dealers profiting off trauma. He discusses how First Nations communities in Ontario are taking action and why change starts with Canada respecting Indigenous law. Kenneth, thanks so much for joining us. To start off, can you tell us how this issue of Toronto drug dealers targeting First Nations communities came to your attention?
It was in the summertime, in June. My colleague Annette Francis knew somebody in the Parry Sound area who was raising the alarm of Toronto gang member drug dealer that was infiltrated a community and possibly was trafficking children as well as selling drugs and using young children to sell the drugs too. Having covered similar stories in Thunder Bay and other parts of Ontario, I twigged to it and I was like, there's something more here. I didn't realize the Toronto gangs were between Parry Sound and Sault Ste. Marie. I thought they were mostly up in Thunder Bay and trying to hit more northern reserves. There's a few gangs, street gangs that have began moving north. They come largely from the North York, Scarborough, Etobicoke area. Jane and Finch is a predominantly known area. And they embed themselves in the community, almost like a tick. And they set up shop and they start dealing their cocaine, their fentanyl, all these things. The thing is, though, in that territory, there's been hundreds, if not thousands, depending on how you look at it, fatal overdoses from these drugs. So I wanted to get more into who these guys are. So I got invited to a community meeting in Wasauksing First Nation next to Parry Sound in June. I went up and I heard the stories of child welfare workers, community members, business owners, people who've grown up with in the communities and have seen it change. And they started to explain a lot of trauma, obviously, but noticing these guys have popped up out of nowhere. They keep showing up. So I realized at that moment that while I've heard these stories before, I have never actually turned my attention squarely on the drug dealers. So that was my goal, and it still is to identify as many of these guys as I can, where they're from, where they're moving to, why they're coming up there. I want to get to know who they are in their family, where they're from, were they born into this life? Because in a lot of ways, these are predominantly Black males. So my understanding is that it's similar upbringings in these inner city impoverished neighborhoods that you would see in certain First Nations communities as well. So there's kind of like this odd parallel. And so I'm trying to understand their trauma and their life, while also understanding that what they're doing is they're profiting off generations of trauma in these communities that are trying to heal. And you have these outsiders who are coming in and just making it so much worse and making so much money off them.
And so how are First Nations in Ontario mobilizing to combat these big city drug dealers from preying on community members?
Well, they start by first talking about it, right? It's like truth and reconciliation. You can't have reconciliation without truth, and that kind of and there's a lot of truth that needs to go around. So the first thing is they start talking about it, and so that was kind of like the rumble, the ripple was like a little pebble in the pond in the summertime at the meeting I was at, and since then I've seen communities community members start talking about it more, like on Facebook and stuff like that, and calling out the dealers in the community because they're not all outsiders. There's a lot of local members, citizens of First Nations that are also involved in this because if you're a user, you're going to sell and that sort of thing, right? They're mobilizing in the sense that they're talking, and behind the scenes, they're all trying to get their own trespassing laws. So if a First Nation enters into a framework agreement with the federal government to develop their own land code, once that's done, they get to opt out. They opt out of like 40 some clauses of the Indian Act that allows them to control their land and resources. Within that, you can create your own laws. And Mississauga First Nation on the northern shore of Lake Huron, a little further up from Parry Sound, from where I started, they actually just recently prosecuted one of their own laws in provincial court for the first time. It's never happened. It's a huge deal because for far too long, police won't enforce First Nations law, and the Crown attorneys won't prosecute it. They'll give you many reasons as to why they won't do this, but it all comes down to one thing, and it's quite obvious: discrimination. Since then, other communities in that territory that have their land codes have met with Mississauga First Nation Chief and Council and have been provided their trespassing law to develop their own. So you have more communities now in that area trying to get up and going so they can use it as a tool to keep drug dealers from their community.
So on a similar note, earlier this year, the Chiefs of Ontario sued the province and the federal government for not respecting First Nations law in provincial court. Why have First Nations been forced to take these issues to court?
Yeah, it's frustrating, but in my opinion, it comes back down to discrimination. In Ontario, we had what is called a Police Services Act. That got changed to the Community and Policing Services Act, or something like that effect. Came into force in April, but they left First Nations laws out of it. But they would have put it at the same level as provincial and federal laws. By not putting them in there, it just kept it at the same status quo, which is they don't care. These laws continue to be ignored. What they did do, though, which is so classic of a government, is they created a pilot project, and it's called a pilot project for private prosecution. And for those who don't know what a private prosecution is, anyone can apply for a private prosecution in Ontario courthouse. And that means you ask the justice of the peace to force a court case and then appoint a prosecutor to prosecute it. Well, what the Ontario did was they're like, hey, we'll give you 30 grand if you apply for this funding. We'll give you 30 grand. You hire your own prosecutor, go through your own private prosecution process, which is the longest way to reach a conviction or a charge in Ontario, and we'll see how it goes. Well, Mississauga First Nation was the first one to do it, and they were successful. So the hope is that will change the perception with police, but really the Crown. But ultimately, it's politics. If the Ontario government, led by Doug Ford, were to just snap their finger, suddenly these laws are respected, and the police will enforce it. The Crown will prosecute it. And it puts First Nations on the same page. But why they don't do that, it's clearly discrimination.
Right. And so it sounds like, there are these major precedents being set with the Mississauga First Nations, successful prosecution, and then, also the Chiefs of Ontario lawsuit. What do you think will be the long-term impact?
Whether people like it or not, First Nations are going to be, have always been, and will be more so now, sovereign. Like they have control of their own land, their own laws, and at some point they're going to be on the same page or the same level as everybody else, at least as according to the system, how they're recognized. So I see all of these First Nation laws being respected, all of them leading to charges and convictions. And hopefully in the long term, for the betterment of the communities that are, some are further ahead than others, but they're all on a healing journey after, generations of trauma, of genocidal policies, all the stuff that we know about. There's, so that's what bugs me the most is these guys that come from Toronto are trying to profit off that last bit, right? Because a lot of communities are, there's a lot of work left to be done, but they're just trying to make money off that pain. It's like, haven't they been through enough, and now you're trying to profit off their trauma? It's kind of sickening. And so, anyways, I think it ultimately leads to the greater change, which is why I called the documentary, or the work I'm doing, the Great Change, because it's time for things to change.
All right, well, thanks so much for joining us, Kenneth. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
But it's not just First Nations communities in Ontario that are grappling with these issues. Back in June 2023, Manitoba Keewatinowi Okimakanak Inc, or MKO, rolled out a protocol with the RCMP and the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. The protocol established a 2-year pilot project empowering the RCMP to enforce and prosecute bylaws in MKO communities. Chief Michael Yellowback's community, the Manto Sipi Cree Nation, was the first to implement the protocol.
Our community is located approximately 750 kilometers northeast of Winnipeg, and we're a remote, isolated community. We only have a winter road service 3 months out of every year, and the majority we have year-round air transportation, and we have 2 air carriers that service our community. Within the last 2 decades, we've had an experience of opioids in our community, and has created health and safety concern for our community members, and where we've seen, on children that their needs have been neglected, and we've seen our elders being abused financially, physically, emotionally. We've seen an escalation of, harder drugs.
Beginning in the late 80s, Manito Sipi passed a series of bylaws banning intoxicants and illegal drugs. But Yellowback said the RCMP wouldn't enforce them.
The challenging part and, frustrating too also at the same time was that it was not recognized by the law enforcement, by the legal community. And when you're trying to, as a leader, trying to address all these issues plagued by our community in terms of alcohol and the drug abuse and the opioids, at that point, it felt like we were failing our community.
At the same time, when First Nations community safety officers tried to take matters into their own hands, they faced consequences. Yellowback claims that in 2020, 5 First Nations community safety officers were charged for trying to prevent the flow of drugs into the community.
Why would they charge our First Nation safety officers, including our 2 council members, who were trying to prevent and save lives of people by stopping the flow of drugs into our community? Indigenous people have governments as well. They elect their own people. What's the difference between a municipal government enacting their bylaws? They're told that they're recognized immediately, enforced immediately. Why can't be the same thing be done for the Indigenous governments who have the authority to set up their bylaws when it comes to protecting our people, our citizens, and preventing the flow of drugs, alcohol into our community?
In 2023, MKO approached Yellowback about the 2-year pilot program on the prosecution and enforcement of bylaws. He was immediately on board.
We accept that invitation to participate in this, and that's where we revisited the draft bylaw that we had developed, and we did more work on this bylaw, and it kind of gained momentum as well. And that, we met with the Department of Justice officials, and including public safety officials, so whether it's in Ottawa, in Winnipeg, and both Manitoba and Canada. And we also heavily advocated and lobbied for them that something needs to be done. And that, to ensure our bylaws are recognized.
Fast forward to September 2024, and 6 First Nation safety officers in Manto Sipi have completed their training. They're now certified to conduct airport bag searches for drugs and alcohol on chartered planes entering the community.
And they have that additional authority that they didn't have. Now that, they can search at the airport, and plus they will be able to have that capability under our that new bylaw.
Yellowback says he's hoping to help other MKO communities implement their own enforcement programs. Manto Sipi is also looking to open a treatment facility to help members get on a path to healing.
These people with addictions, they're all good people. They're just in that, bad state of, a dependency on drugs or alcohol. And that's what we want to bring them back, to bring out the good people in them. So, because I know that they're hurting right now, and, they have issues. And when they have, traumas that they have met in their lives, losing a loved one or could be something else, they run to drugs, they run to alcohol. So we keep telling them that, alcohol and drugs is not the answer.
This episode of APTN News in Focus was produced by Mark Blackburn and Charmaine Straker. In Focus is edited by Jesse Andrushko and hosted by me, Sierra Bettens. In Focus is available wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Kathleen Martins, a reporter with APTN News. Homeless, houseless, shelterless people. They aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. But who are they? Hear their stories in my podcast called Our Relatives. Listen on your favorite player.